The man didn't even look at her when he said it. Harlan Briggs stood in the middle of that relay station with his thumbs hooked into his belt and his hat pushed back just far enough to show the contempt on his face, and he said it loud. Loud enough for every person in that room to hear, loud enough that it would follow her out the door and down the road and all the way to the edge of whatever life she was trying to build. Woman traveling alone with 2 bastard children has no business expecting charity from decent folk. You want to stay in coal, you'll need a man to vouch for you, and I don't see one. He didn't even look at her when he said it. That was the part that stayed with her, not the words, the ease of them. Clara Whitmore stood in that station with her daughter's shoulders under her hands and $12 in her bag and 3,000 miles of road behind her, and she made herself a promise so quiet it didn't even need words. She wasn't going anywhere. If this story hit something in you, hit like right now and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with Clara. She's just getting started. The stagecoach had been 3 days late out of Sacramento, delayed by a washed-out section of road that no one had bothered to repair since the last storm. Clara had spent those 3 days in a relay house with 12 other passengers, 2 of whom made it clear they'd have preferred she sit somewhere else. The twins had slept curled against her sides both nights, their small bodies warm and trusting in a way that made Clara feel like she was carrying something she had no right to drop. She hadn't slept much. She'd spent most of those hours going over the letter again in her head. Even though she'd read it so many times, the paper had softened at the folds. Samuel's handwriting, Samuel's words. Come west, Clara. I have land. I have a house that needs a woman in it, and my daughters need a mother. Come and we'll build something together. She'd held that letter like a contract, like a deed, like something that meant she wasn't traveling 3,000 miles toward nothing. Samuel Thompson was dead before she reached the California line. A man at the relay station in Stockton had told her, matter-of-factly, the way men delivered bad news when it wasn't their bad news. Fever. 6 weeks ago. Fast at the end. His brother was running the ranch now. Clara had stood very still when she heard that. Lily had asked her why she'd stopped walking, and she'd said she was just thinking. She'd picked up her bag and kept moving because there was nothing else to do. The stage didn't turn around. Cole was smaller than she'd pictured. One main street, a general store, a saloon, a livery, a church with a crooked bell tower, and a scattering of wooden buildings that looked like they'd been dropped from height and just left where they landed. The stagecoach pulled in at just past noon, and half the town seemed to have something to do near the relay station at that particular moment. Clara stepped down from the coach with Lily on her left and Lucy on her right, one bag in her free hand, and she knew without looking that people were watching. She'd learned to feel that, the weight of eyes, the particular stillness of a crowd that's decided something before you've opened your mouth. Harlan Briggs had been leaning against the station post when the coach arrived. She didn't know his name yet. She'd learn it fast enough. He said what he said, and the room went quiet, and Clara stood there with her daughter's shoulders under her hands and felt the old, familiar sensation of being assessed and found wanting by someone who'd already made up his mind. Lily looked up at her. Mama, why is that man being rude? Hush, Clara said quietly. But he is. I know. She looked at Harlan Briggs directly. He was still watching her with that flat, checking things off expression, and she thought about what she wanted to say and what it would cost her to say it, and she filed the first option away and opened her mouth for the second. I'm looking for Ethan Thompson, she said. If you know where I can find him, I'd be grateful for the direction. If you don't, I'll ask someone else. Briggs smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. Thompson's ranch is 4 miles north, but I'd save yourself the walk if I were you. Man's not expecting company, he actually wants. Then he can tell me that himself. She picked up her bag. A woman near the back of the small crowd, middle-aged, sharp eyes, wearing a practical apron, said, Stage relay boy can point you north, hun. Road's clear enough. Clara nodded at her. Thank you. She walked out of that station with her back straight and her daughter's hands in hers, and she did not look at Harlan Briggs again. She'd deal with men like that her whole life. They weren't the worst thing she'd faced, not by half, but something about the way he'd said bastard children, so casually, so publicly, had settled into her chest like a splinter she was going to feel every time she moved. The relay boy was 14 and amiable and pointed her north without a single complicating word. She thanked him and started walking. Lily said, "Are we almost there?" "Almost." "You said that 2 days ago." "2 days ago I meant Sacramento. Now I mean the ranch." Lucy, who had been quiet since the station, said, "What if the man doesn't want us?" Clara kept walking. "Then we figure out something else." "What's something else?" "I'll know it when I see it." That was the truest thing she could offer them. She'd spent enough of her life making promises she couldn't back up, and she'd stopped doing it somewhere around the time she buried their father and realized the world had no obligation to be manageable. You kept going. You looked at what was in front of you, and you figured out the next thing. That was all there was. The road north was dry and rutted, edged with scrub and the occasional oak. It was hot. Clara had dressed practically. She'd learned that much in 2 years of getting by, but practically dressed was still warm in a California summer, and the twins were starting to drag their feet by the second mile. "Carry me," Lily said. "I can't carry you and the bag both." "Leave the bag." "Everything we own is in that bag." Lily considered this. "Can Lucy carry it?" "Lucy's 5. "So am I." "So you are," Clara said. "Which is why neither of you is carrying it." They walked. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Cattle, wood smoke, the particular dry smell of worked land. Then the fence line came into view, and the house beyond it, and she stopped for a moment at the gate. It was a working ranch, she could see that. Not prosperous, but maintained. The fence was repaired in places, but it was repaired. The house was plain, 2 stories, the paint faded to a color that might have once been white. There was a vegetable garden on the east side that had been planted but not tended recently. The weeds were coming up through the rows. A man came out of the barn. He was tall, lean, in the way that came from hard work rather than deprivation, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of tan that meant he spent more hours outside than in. He stopped when he saw them at the gate. He wasn't holding anything, but his hands went still in a way that meant he'd been about to do something and had forgotten what it was. Clara opened the gate and walked in, because standing outside it waiting wasn't going to solve anything. "Mr. Thompson," she said. He stared at her for a moment. Up close, she could see he was maybe 35, with a jaw that needed shaving and eyes that were the color of creek water in shadow. He looked at her, then at the twins, then back at her, and she could see him working through something. "You're Clara Whitmore," he said. "I am. Sam wrote me you were coming." A pause. "He died before I could write you back." "I know, I found out in Stockton." Something crossed his face. She couldn't name it exactly. Not guilt, not quite. More like the expression of a man who'd been handed a problem he'd hoped someone else would solve, and was only now accepting that it was going to be him. "You kept coming anyway," he said. There was nowhere to turn back to. He looked at the twins again. Lucy had moved slightly behind Clara's leg. Lily was watching him with the direct, evaluating stare of a 5-year-old who'd decided she was going to form an opinion and stick to it. "What are their names?" he asked. "This is Lily. That's Lucy." Lily said, "Are you the one who was supposed to be our papa?" Ethan blinked. "No, that was my brother Samuel." "Where is he?" "He passed away." Lily chewed on that. "So now we don't have one." "Lily," Clara said. "What?" "It's true." Ethan crouched down to the twins' level, which surprised Clara. Most men didn't bother. He looked at Lily first, then at Lucy, who peeked out from behind Clara's leg at the movement. "I'm Ethan," he said. "I'm Samuel's brother." "Do you have horses?" Lily asked. "I have 6 horses." "Can we see them?" "Lily—" "It's all right," Ethan said, and stood back up. He looked at Clara, and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You need somewhere to sleep tonight," he said finally. "We do." "I've got a spare room. It's not much. We're not asking for much." He nodded once, slowly, the way men nodded when they'd made a decision they weren't entirely comfortable with and were pretending it was simpler than it was. "Come in then," he said. "I'll put some water on." He turned and walked toward the house, and Clara followed him with her daughters, and the gate swung shut behind them with the particular sound of a closing that is also an opening, if you're paying attention. The kitchen was clean enough, which told her something. A man who doesn't care lets a kitchen go to ruin. Ethan Thompson had dirty dishes in the basin and dust on the top shelf, but the floor was swept, and the table was level, and the wood stove showed signs of regular use. She noted all of this automatically, the way she'd learned to note things, not from suspicion, but from the habit of assessing what she was walking into. He put water on without asking what she wanted. He pulled 2 chairs away from the table and set them together so the twins could sit side by side, which he did without making a production of it, just moved the chairs and stepped back. "Have you eaten?" he asked. "At the relay station, this morning." He opened the bread box and looked inside, then the larder, and assembled something on a plate that was bread and cold beef and 2 wrinkled apples, and he set it on the table in front of the twins like it was nothing, like feeding strangers' children was something he did every day. Lucy came out from behind Clara's leg to look at the apple. Clara said, "You don't have to." "I know," Ethan said. "Sit down." She sat. He poured 2 cups of water and set one in front of her, and then he sat across the table, and they looked at each other over the rough wood with the sound of the twins eating between them. "You have no family back east?" he asked. "My parents died when I was 17. I have a sister in Ohio, but we don't—" She stopped. "No. No one to go back to." "And your husband, the twins' father?" "Consumption. 3 years ago." He nodded. Not with sympathy exactly, more with the recognition of a man who'd lost people himself and knew better than to perform grief he didn't own. "Samuel's letter said you ran a boarding house," he said, "for 2 years. I could cook, I could manage a house, I could keep accounts. It was enough to keep us." She paused. "When his letter came, I thought—" She stopped again. "You thought it was a way out." "I thought it was a chance," she said carefully. "There's a difference." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside, something moved in the yard. One of the dogs, she thought, circling the house in its evening patrol. The light through the kitchen window had gone gold and beginning to tip toward orange. "I was going to write you," he said, "when Sam died. Tell you not to come." "I know. I should have found a way to get that letter to you faster. Mr. Thompson." She set her hands flat on the table. "I'm not here to be your obligation. I understand your brother is gone and the arrangement is gone with him. I'm asking for one night's shelter while I figure out what comes next. That's all." He looked at her hands on the table, then at her face. "One night?" he repeated, and she could hear in his voice that neither of them believed it. "One night to start," she amended. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face. It made him look younger, or maybe just less carefully controlled. "There's a room at the top of the stairs," he said. "The bed's made. It's not— I'm sure it's fine. There's no curtain on the window. We'll manage." Lily, who had eaten half her bread and both apple slices, said without looking up, "Are the horses in the barn?" "They are," Ethan said. "Can I see them tomorrow?" He looked at Lily for a moment. She was looking back at him with the specific patience of a 5-year-old who'd already decided the answer was going to be yes and was just waiting for the adult to catch up. "Sure," he said. Lily went back to her bread, satisfied. That was how it started. Osha. Clara did not sleep much the first night. She lay in the narrow bed with the twins tucked on either side of her, listening to the house settle, listening to the quiet that was so different from every quiet she'd known before. Not the thin-walled noise of a boarding house, not the cramped closeness of a stagecoach, not the particular isolation of a relay station. This was a working ranch quiet, with the animals in the barn and the night birds out in the dark, and the sound, once, of Ethan's boots crossing the floor in the room below. She thought about what she had. She had $12.40. She had 2 dresses besides the one she was wearing, a good pair of boots that were nearly through at the left heel, a small collection of the twins' clothes, a bone-handled knife, her mother's silver thimble, and a letter of recommendation from the boarding house owner in Ohio that she'd been smart enough to keep even when she packed light. She thought about what she needed. Longer term than one night was what she needed. She needed a way to make enough money to rent a room, to feed herself and the girls. To find something sustainable that didn't depend on the goodwill of a man she'd met 4 hours ago. She was still thinking through the options when she fell asleep. She woke at 5, which was her habit, and was downstairs in the kitchen with water on for coffee before she heard Ethan's boots on the stairs. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. "You're up," he said. "I'm always up at 5. He came in and looked at the coffee pot on the stove, then at her. "You didn't have to," he said. "I was up anyway." She'd found the coffee and the pot without difficulty. The kitchen, she'd noted, was organized by someone who valued function over ease, everything in a logical place, just not an intuitive one. She'd had to open 4 cupboards to find the coffee, but she'd found it. He sat at the table. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat across from where she'd sat the night before, which was not the same as sitting across from him. They drank in silence for a few minutes. "The garden's gone to weeds," she said. "I know." "How long since someone tended it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Sam planted it in April. He was gone by end of May." She nodded. That explained the state of it. Planted, never finished. "I could bring it back," she said, "if I'm here long enough." "That's the question, isn't it?" "How long can you spare the room?" He turned his cup in his hands. "I'm not going to put 2 children out of a house," he said. "That's not something I'm able to do. What about one adult woman who came here under circumstances that no longer apply?" "Same answer." She looked at him. "Why?" He looked back. "Because putting you out doesn't solve anything. You've got no money and 2 small girls, and the nearest town that might have work is 40 miles south. Sending you back to Cole with $12 and nowhere to sleep serves no one. How do you know how much money I have?" "I don't. I'm guessing. Am I wrong?" She didn't answer, which was its own answer. He nodded. "You can stay," he said. "We'll figure out the rest." "I'm not a charity case, Mr. Thompson." "I know. I mean that. I will work for whatever room and board you offer. Cooking, cleaning, the garden, accounts if you keep any. I keep some. Whatever you need. I'm not asking for wages, not at first. I'm asking for a fair exchange." He considered this. He was the kind of man, she was beginning to see, who thought before he spoke, who didn't fill silence with noise just because the silence was there. "The house needs work," he said. "More than I've had time to give it. Sam's death and then the spring cattle work. He stopped. "The house has been let go." "I can see that. If you're offering to manage the house in exchange for room and board, that's a reasonable arrangement. Then that's what I'm offering." "For how long?" "Until I have enough saved to do something else. Or until it doesn't suit us both anymore." He thought about that. "That's a vague arrangement." "Most honest ones are." That moved his face again, that thing that was adjacent to a smile. "All right," he said. "We'll try it." "Good. One condition." She waited. "I have a neighbor, Hattie Larson. She's—" He paused, choosing his words. "She talks. The whole county will know you're here by end of week regardless. When they ask, you're here as the woman Samuel was bringing out, taking care of the house while we sort out the circumstances, not a widow I've taken in." Clara understood what he was protecting. She'd have done the same. "Understood," she said. "Hattie'll still talk." "People like that always do," he nodded. "She's not malicious, she just doesn't know when something's her business and when it isn't." "Exactly." Clara finished her coffee. Outside, the sky was going from black to that particular dark blue that was the last darkness before morning, and she could hear the cattle beginning to move in the pasture, the low sound of animals coming to life. "I'll need to know where things are," she said. "For the house. What you have, what you need, where you keep the accounts. I can show you. And I'll need to take the twins to town at some point this week. They need shoes that fit. I'll drive you. You don't have to sit. Cole's 4 miles. You're not walking 4 miles with 2 5-year-olds to buy shoes." She started to argue and then stopped, because he was right, and arguing against sensible things was a waste of energy she needed elsewhere. "Fine," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and pushed back from the table to start his morning, and Clara sat alone in the kitchen for a few minutes more, listening to the ranch wake up around her, and thought, "All right, this is what there is. Make something of it." She went to find a broom. Hattie Larson arrived on Thursday. Clara heard the wagon before she saw it and came to the kitchen doorway to look. The woman who climbed down from the seat was 50 or so, stout, wearing a sunbonnet and the particular expression of someone who's come ostensibly to welcome a neighbor, but actually to gather information. "You must be the widow woman," Hattie said. "Clara Whitmore," Clara said. "Can I help you?" "I brought preserves." Hattie held up a jar. "Berry. I make it every summer. Ethan doesn't eat it, he never has, but I bring it anyway." She said this without self-consciousness, as though it was a simple and established fact, and maybe it was. "Come in," Clara said, because there was no alternative that wasn't rude, and being rude to the neighbor who talked would cause more problems than an hour's discomfort. Hattie Larson was not stupid, which was worse than if she had been. A stupid gossip was easy to manage. Hattie had sharp eyes that took in the clean kitchen floor, the repotted herbs on the window ledge, the fresh curtain that Clara had made from a flour sack she'd found in the cellar, and she assembled these details with visible interest. "Place looks different," Hattie said. "I've been tidying." Sam never was much for housekeeping, Ethan even less. She set the preserves on the table and sat down without being invited, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how Hattie operated. "Your girls are sweet. I saw them in the yard with Ethan this morning. They like the horses. Ethan was showing them how to brush one down. Didn't know he had that in him." Clara had known it for 3 days. She'd watched from the kitchen window, the twins standing on upturned buckets to reach the horse's back, Ethan guiding Lily's arm in the correct direction with a patience that surprised her. He hadn't said anything about it. He'd just done it. "He's been kind to them," Clara said. "He's a good man. Always has been." Hattie folded her hands on the table. "This whole situation is irregular, of course. Most situations are, when you look at them honestly. I only mean that people will talk. People are already talking. You came to see what there was to talk about." Hattie went still for a moment, and then, to Clara's genuine surprise, she laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one. "Fair enough," Hattie said. "I did. So now you've seen it. A woman who came here for a purpose that no longer exists, making herself useful in exchange for room and board. That's the whole story." "Is it?" "It is." Hattie looked around the kitchen again. "You've done a lot in 3 days." "The work was there." "Sam's garden. I saw it from the road. Did you pull those weeds?" "Yesterday afternoon." "That's a big garden." The girls helped. Lily has a gift for identifying which plants are actually weeds and which aren't. Lucy mostly threw dirt, but she enjoyed it. Hattie was quiet for a moment. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Honestly, someone more desperate looking." Clara poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one in front of Hattie, because the conversation had turned into something that might be worth having. "I am desperate," Clara said. "I just find it more useful to look like I'm not." Hattie wrapped her hands around her cup and studied Clara with a different kind of attention than she'd walked in with. "Ethan won't say 2 words against a person," Hattie said. "But I know he was glad when he didn't have to send you back." "Why?" "Because he's been alone a long time. This house has been too quiet for years." She paused. "I'm not implying anything." "I know you're not. I just mean, some houses need people in them. This one does." She drank her coffee. "The preserves are good on biscuits." "I'll make some tomorrow," Clara said, and meant it. Hattie stayed an hour. She talked about the county, about who farmed what and who owed whom, and which of the local disputes had been going on longer than anyone could remember. Clara listened and said little and filed everything away, because information about the community she was living in was information she needed. At the door, leaving, Hattie said, "That man Briggs who was at the station when you came in." Clara stilled slightly. "I know who you mean. He runs the land association. Most of the ranches around here, he's got some kind of hand in them. Loans, disputes, access to the river channel. He's—" Hattie paused. "You'd do well to stay out of his way." "I intend to." "He already knows you're here. He'll have something to say about it eventually." "People usually do," Clara said. "Thank you for the preserves, Mrs. Larson." Hattie climbed back into her wagon. "I'll come Tuesday," she said, as though this was established. "I'll bring eggs." She drove away, and Clara stood in the doorway and thought about Harlan Briggs and his flat checking things off eyes, and the particular way he'd let bastard children drop out of his mouth like it cost him nothing. She went inside to start dinner. Ethan came in from the pasture at dusk with mud on his boots and a cut on his right hand that he was ignoring. Clara saw the cut when he poured himself water at the basin, a clean slice across 3 knuckles that had stopped bleeding but needed cleaning. "Sit down," she said. "It's fine." "Sit down, Mr. Thompson." He sat. She got the clean cloth she kept for this purpose and the carbolic she'd found in the medicine cabinet, and she cleaned the cut while he held still with the particular stoicism of a man who's learned that fighting the person cleaning your wound makes it take longer. "Fence wire," he said. "I assumed. I had gloves on, missed the one spot that mattered. That's how it usually goes." She wrapped the hand loosely. "Hattie Larson came today." "I figured she would." "She told me about Harlan Briggs." He went still for a moment in a way that was different from his regular stillness. "What did she say?" "That he runs the land association, that most ranches have some connection to him." Clara finished the wrapping and sat back. "What kind of connection do you have?" Ethan looked at his wrapped hand. "The ranch has a loan through the association, 3 years ago, after a bad season. Sam was still alive then. It was Sam's decision. We were behind on the payment when he died." "Are you still behind?" "I caught it up in April, but Briggs—" He stopped. "He doesn't let people forget what they owe him, even when they don't owe him anymore." Clara looked at him. "He's looking for leverage. That's his way. And a woman living unchaperoned on your property is the kind of thing he could use to pressure the land association." Ethan met her eyes. "I'm not telling you this to worry you. I'm telling you because you asked, and you deserve to know what the situation is." "I appreciate that." She folded the remaining cloth. "What can he actually do?" "Call in associations of debt that don't officially exist. Make it difficult to sell cattle at market. The water rights for the North Pasture run through an agreement with the association that he administers." He said it evenly, but she could hear the weight underneath. He's not a man who does things directly. "How long has he been like this?" "Long as I've known him. 20 years, maybe more." "What does he actually want?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Land. This parcel borders his on the north side. Sam wouldn't sell to him. I won't either." Clara looked at her hands on the table. "So I'm convenient," she said. "You're a reason, if he needs one." "And before I arrived?" "He'd have found another reason eventually." He met her eyes again. "That's not your fault." "I know it isn't." She pushed her chair back. "But it's useful information." She got up to check the pot on the stove, and Ethan sat at the table with his wrapped hand and didn't say anything more. And that was how the first real understanding between them happened. Not through sentiment, but through plain speaking. 2 people telling each other the truth about what they were standing in. The twins were asleep upstairs. The house had the quiet of evening, the fire in the stove and the last light going out the windows. Clara stirred the pot and thought, Harlan Briggs. She thought about the relay station and the way he'd said what he'd said without looking at her, and the ease of it, the comfortable, practiced ease of a man who'd been doing damage that way for so long it had become habit. She thought, I've dealt with men like that before. She thought, I'll deal with this one too. The pot boiled and she lowered the flame and called up the stairs that dinner was ready, and Lucy answered from the top step, and Lily's voice came right behind hers. And downstairs in the kitchen, Ethan Thompson pushed back his chair and went to wash up at the basin, and for a moment the house had a sound in it that a house needs, the overlapping sound of people, real people, going about the business of an evening. Clara set plates on the table. Whatever came next, she thought, this was where she was. This was what she had. She picked up the ladle. The preserves Hattie brought sat on the kitchen shelf for exactly 2 days before Clara made good on her promise. She mixed the biscuits at 5:30 in the morning the way her mother had taught her. Cold butter, quick hands, don't work it too long or it gets tough. And had them in the oven before the twins were awake. When Ethan came in from the barn at 6:15, he stopped in the kitchen doorway the same way he had that first morning, but this time his face did something different. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the biscuits cooling on the cloth and at the open jar of preserves, and then sat down at the table. "You didn't have to," he said. "I said I would." He ate 2 biscuits with the preserves and drank his coffee and didn't say much, which she'd learned was not coldness, but just his way in the early morning. He needed a little time to come fully present to the day. She'd noticed that in the first week and stopped reading it as distance. Lily appeared at the kitchen door in her nightgown, hair in every direction, and announced without preamble that Lucy had knocked the water pitcher off the dresser upstairs. "Is it broken?" Clara asked. "Just the handle." "Is Lucy hurt?" "No. She's just sitting there looking at the pieces." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "Go tell her I'll be up in a minute and not to touch the broken part." Lily went. Ethan, who had watched this exchange over his coffee cup, said, "There's another pitcher in the cellar, blue one." "Thank you. Handle's loose on that one, too." "I'll fix it." He looked at her. "You know how to fix a pitcher handle?" "I know how to wrap wire tight enough that it holds for a year, close enough." She went upstairs to deal with the broken pitcher and the 5-year-old sitting in the middle of the ceramic pieces with the expression of someone waiting to be told whether to cry or not. Clara crouched down and looked at her daughter's face and said, "Were you trying to get water?" Lucy nodded. "By yourself, before I was up?" Another nod. "Because you were thirsty." "Very thirsty," Lucy said with the gravity of a person describing an epic circumstance. Clara picked up the pieces one by one, careful of the edges. "Next time you wake up thirsty before I'm up, come get me. That's what I'm here for." "I didn't want to bother you." Clara stilled for a moment. She put the last piece in her hand and looked at her daughter, who was 5 years old and had already learned to manage her own needs quietly because she'd watched her mother do it for 2 years and absorbed the lesson the way children absorb everything, without knowing they were learning it. "Lucy," she said, "you are not a bother. You are never a bother. Do you understand me?" Lucy considered this seriously. "Even when I knock things over?" "Even then." "Lily said I was a bother this morning because she wanted to sleep and I woke her up." Lily was wrong. From down the hall, Lily's voice came through the wall. "I was not wrong. She was very loud." Clara stood up with the broken pieces. "Both of you get dressed," she said. "Breakfast is on." The garden was the first real project. She'd pulled the weeds in the first week, but pulling weeds wasn't the same as bringing a garden back. The beds needed turning, the soil was hard from neglect, and 2 of the rows had been planted wrong. Too close together, which had been Samuel's mistake, probably made in optimism rather than knowledge. Clara found a spade in the tool shed and started the work on a Wednesday morning, while the twins sat at the edge of the garden and were variously helpful. Lily handed her things when asked. Lucy moved dirt from one place to another for reasons that remained her own. Ethan came by mid-morning and stood at the edge of the garden the way he stood at the edge of most things she did. Not interfering, not offering help she hadn't asked for, just taking stock. "Those 2 rows need to come up," she said without looking at him. "I see that. Samuel planted them 4 inches apart. You can't grow beans 4 inches apart." Sam didn't know much about gardening. "Did you know when he planted them?" "I wasn't here. I was in Sacramento dealing with the association." She turned a section of soil. "He thought about you, I think, when he laid out these beds. The spacing on the far row is perfect. Then it gets ambitious." Ethan was quiet. "I'm not saying it as a criticism," Clara said. He was trying. He always was." She kept working. After a moment, Ethan said, "I'll turn the hard section if you want. Back corner's nearly clay." "I can manage." "I know, but I've got 20 minutes and a stronger back." She stepped aside, and he took the spade and worked the back corner of the garden, and they moved around each other without getting in the way, which required a small, wordless negotiation that they completed without either of them commenting on it. Lucy came over and stood next to Ethan while he worked. She'd decided, sometime in the second week, that Ethan was interesting. She watched him with the concentrated attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. "Why is the dirt different colors?" she asked him. He paused and looked at the soil. "Darker means more water got to it. Lighter means it's drier. Why? Because dry soil is lighter than wet soil. Why? Because water is heavier than air. Lucy chewed on this. What about the rocks? Rocks are different. Why? Ethan leaned on the spade and looked at Lucy with the expression of a man who just walked into a longer conversation than he'd expected. How many questions do you have? A lot, Lucy said simply. That's what I thought. Clara, who had been listening with her back turned, pressed her lips together to keep the smile from showing. 3 weeks in, she found the accounts. Ethan kept them in a wooden box on the shelf in the room he used as an office. A room that also served as a place to store tools that didn't fit in the shed, extra rope, seed catalogs from 2 seasons ago. The box held receipts, a ledger that had been kept sporadically, and a folder of papers from the Land Association that Clara sat down with at the table and read in full. The loan was for $420, taken out in April of 1861. They were current on payments, as Ethan had said, but the terms had a clause on page 3 that she read twice to make sure she was understanding it correctly. She brought it to Ethan that evening. This clause, she said. She set the paper on the table and put her finger on the paragraph. If the property changes designation, if it's split, subdivided, or transferred in part, the full balance of the loan comes due within 30 days. Ethan read where she was pointing. His jaw went tight. I know about the clause, he said. Does Briggs know that you know? He knows I read the agreement. But does he know you understood this part? He looked up from the paper. Why? Because the way he's been circling this property, coming to the station, saying what he said to me, making it difficult in small ways, it doesn't feel like he wants to call in the loan. He wants you to have to subdivide. Ethan set the paper down. The North Pasture, Clara said. You mentioned the water rights run through the association on the north boundary. They do. So if he makes enough trouble, enough pressure, and you have to sell the north parcel to cover costs, the full loan comes due immediately, which you can't cover, which means he gets the rest of the property at settlement price. Ethan sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. You got all that from one clause. I got all that from 3 weeks of watching him operate from a distance. She picked the paper back up. Have you talked to anyone? A lawyer? Another rancher? There's no lawyer in Coral. What about Stockton? Sacramento? That costs money I don't have, Clara. She was quiet for a moment. It was the first time he'd used her first name, and neither of them acknowledged it, but it sat in the air between them differently than Mrs. Whitmore had. Let me keep the accounts, she said. Formally. I kept books for the boarding house for 2 years. I'm accurate and I catch things. I can see you catch things. I'll keep a proper running ledger and I'll flag anything that looks like it has implications for the association terms. If he moves, I'll know what move he made before you feel the effect of it. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. That's more than I hired you to do. The arrangement was for fair exchange. This is what I'm able to offer that's useful. Do you want it or not? Yes, he said. No hesitation. Good. She set the folder back in order. Then tomorrow I'll start a clean ledger from January and track everything forward. I'll need access to your receipts. The box is yours. She nodded and picked up the folder to take back to the office. At the door she stopped. Ethan? He looked up. Don't underestimate him. Men like Briggs are patient. I know. And they use other people's pride against them. The moment you decide you can handle it without showing weakness, that's when he'll move. Ethan held her gaze. How do you know that? She thought about the boarding house and the landlord who'd raised the rent, and the neighbor who'd reported her to the town council for operating without a permit, and the dozen small daily pressures that men had applied to her over 2 years, confident she'd have no recourse. Experience, she said, and went into the office. Hattie came on Tuesday as promised, and then the following Tuesday, and then it stopped being announced and became simply a fact of the week. She brought eggs the second time, corn from her garden the third, and the fourth time she brought her daughter-in-law, a thin, nervous woman named Ada, who said almost nothing but watched the twins with the look of someone who'd wanted children and not yet had them. Clara made coffee and let the visits find their own shape. She was careful not to perform warmth she didn't feel. But Hattie was genuinely interesting once you got past her need to know everything, and Ada turned out to have a practical knowledge of local plants, what grew where, what the indigenous people of the region had used various roots for, that Clara found directly useful. The community was taking shape around her in her understanding, not as a welcoming thing, but as a system she could learn. Who had influence, and who only thought they did? Who was Briggs's man, and who was quietly resentful of him? The farrier who worked for Briggs on contract but talked too freely when he'd had a drink. The woman at the general store in Cole, Mrs. Everts, who controlled the line of credit most families depended on, and who had no patience for Briggs's grandiosity, even while she worked within his system. Clara went to the store on Fridays when she took the twins to town, and she was always courteous to Mrs. Everts, and Mrs. Everts was always courteous back, and over 3 weeks this had become a kind of reliable mutual recognition that wasn't friendship but was better than nothing. One Friday, while she was tallying her purchases, Mrs. Everts said without looking up from the counter, "Briggs was in here Monday asking about the Thompson account." Clara kept her face level. "What did you tell him?" "That accounts are private." Mrs. Everts looked up then. "We pay cash, Mrs. Whitmore. It's on the receipt." "I know. Thank you." "He asked who does the buying now. I told him the same woman who comes in every Friday." Clara met her eyes. "What did he say to that?" "He said women shouldn't be managing ranch accounts." Mrs. Everett stamped the receipt with more force than was strictly necessary. "I told him I'd been managing my own accounts for 22 years and my husband's before that, and he could take his opinion of women out the door with him." Clara took her receipt. "Mrs. Everts," she said, "I wonder if I could ask you something." "Go ahead." "The association loan terms. Do other ranchers have the same subdivision clause?" The older woman went still for just a second, the pause of someone who knows more than they've said. "Most of the loans written since '59 have it," she said carefully. "Briggs wrote that clause himself. He calls it a stability provision." "And before '59? "Before '59, the loans were written through the county bank, different terms." She folded her hands on the counter. "Why do you ask?" "Because I'd like to know which ranchers are working under the same arrangement. If there are 5 or 6 of them with the same vulnerability, Briggs can't move against all of them at once." Mrs. Everts looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Come back Wednesday, after 2. I'll have some figures that might interest you." Clara picked up her purchases. "I'll be here," she said. She didn't tell Ethan about the conversation with Mrs. Everts until she had the figures in hand. She'd learned that he was a man who didn't do well with half information. He needed the whole picture, or he'd fill in the missing parts with the worst version, not because he was pessimistic by nature, but because years of managing hard seasons alone had trained him that way. Wednesday's figures were worth waiting for. Mrs. Everts, it turned out, had kept her own meticulous records of every account that had gone through the association loan system, partly out of business practice, and partly, Clara suspected, out of the same instinct Clara herself had. You keep track, because someday you'll need to know. 7 ranches, 7 loans with identical subdivision clauses. 6 of them currently current on payment, 1 slightly behind. All of them sitting on land that bordered either Briggs's existing property or the water channel he'd been trying to control for the better part of a decade. Clara walked back to the ranch with the twins and sat in the kitchen that evening after dinner and wrote it all out on paper. When Ethan came in, she put it in front of him. He read it twice. "How did you get this?" he said. "Mrs. Everts." He looked up. "She gave you association records?" "She gave me information she keeps for her own purposes. She doesn't like Briggs any more than you do. She's just been waiting for someone to do something useful with it." Ethan set the paper down. 7 ranches, he said. 7 ranches. If we're all operating under the same terms, we're all under the same threat. But Briggs can only move against 1 or 2 at a time before the pattern becomes obvious and the county takes notice. He's been moving slowly. "Yes. So we need to move first, but carefully." She folded her hands on the table. "There needs to be a meeting, not announced publicly, just the ranchers who hold these loans." Ethan was quiet, looking at the paper. "You know most of them," she said. "Don't you?" "I know all of them, some better than others." "Would they come if you asked?" "Rutherford wouldn't. He thinks he's got an arrangement with Briggs, which means Briggs has him exactly where he wants him." He tapped the paper. But Calloway, the Marsh family, the widow Denton, yes, they'd come. And the one who's behind on payment? That's Art Foley. He's barely keeping the place going. His wife's been sick. Clara thought about Art Foley, whom she'd never met, getting behind on a loan with a clause in it that Harlan Briggs knew how to use. He especially needs to be there, she said. Ethan looked at her across the table with an expression she hadn't quite seen from him before. Not surprised, because he'd stopped being surprised by her in the first week, but something more considered, like he was recalculating something. "You've been working on this since you read the loan documents," he said. "I've been thinking about it, yes." "That's 3 weeks. Problems don't get smaller when you ignore them." "Clara." He said it directly, not as preamble to something else. "Why are you doing this?" She met his eyes. "Because I live here. Because this ranch is where my daughters sleep at night. Because if Briggs takes this land, we're back to 4 miles on foot with a bag and nowhere to go." She held his gaze. "It's self-interest, Ethan. I'm not pretending it's more than that." "It's more than that." "Maybe, but even if it weren't, the effect is the same." He was quiet for a moment. "The meeting," he said. "If I call it, you'd need to not be there." "I know. Not because I know," she said again. "You bring a woman into a room full of ranchers you're trying to convince. You've given them something to talk about that isn't Briggs." She picked up the paper and folded it. "Call the meeting. Tell me what they say." He nodded slowly. Outside, the night had come down fully, and the house was quiet except for the sound of the twins sleeping upstairs and the occasional movement of an animal out in the dark. Ethan sat at the table for a while after Clara went to check on the girls, and when she came back down, he was still there, looking at the lamp. "My brother would have liked you," he said, not looking at her. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. "He wasn't a complicated man," Ethan said, "but he had good instincts about people. He wrote me that you were someone worth waiting for." He looked up then. "I thought it was just Sam being Sam, enthusiastic about everything." Clara was quiet. "He was right," Ethan said simply. Then he pushed back from the table. "I'll reach out to Calloway tomorrow." He went upstairs, and Clara stood in the kitchen and listened to the house around her and felt, not happiness exactly, because happiness was a thing that required a certain safety she hadn't let herself feel yet, but something close to it, something that was the beginning of a thing that might become it. She put out the lamp. She thought about Samuel Thompson, who she'd never met, and his letter that had brought her west, and how strange it was that the kindest thing he'd ever done for her was introduce her to his brother through the fact of his own absence. She didn't let herself think too long on that. There was something uncomfortable at the center of it that she wasn't ready to look at directly. She went upstairs. Lily had kicked her blanket off in her sleep. Clara picked it up and tucked it back around her, and Lucy didn't stir. For a moment, Clara stood in the dark room with her hands at her sides and looked at her daughters sleeping and thought, whatever happens with Briggs and the meeting and the 7 ranches and the loan clause, this is what it's for, this specific thing, these 2. She went to her own room and lay down on the narrow bed and listened to the ranch quiet around her, and slept better than she had in years. Briggs came on a Saturday. He didn't announce himself. His horse was at the fence post when Ethan came out of the barn, and he was sitting it with the practiced ease of a man making a point about how comfortable he was everywhere he chose to be. Clara heard the voice from the kitchen and went to the window. She didn't go out. "Thompson," Briggs said, "wanted to stop by, check on the property." "The property's fine," Ethan said. "I heard you had some changes around here." "I don't know what you heard." Briggs looked at the house. His eyes went to the kitchen window, and Clara stepped back, but not before she'd seen what was in his face. Not curiosity, exactly. More like a man reviewing an asset he hadn't decided what to do with yet. "Woman from the East, wasn't she?" Briggs said. "Your brother's intended. She's managing the household." "That's a new arrangement. It's a private one." "Sure." Briggs shifted in the saddle. "Only reason I mention it, the association's got some thoughts about what constitutes a household in good standing, for the purposes of the loan terms." Ethan said nothing. Man living alone is one thing, Briggs went on, pleasant as a man discussing weather. Man living with a woman who isn't his wife, well, people talk. Makes the association nervous. The association, Ethan said, is a lending body. It doesn't have opinions about household arrangements. The board does. Then the board can put their opinion in writing, and I'll respond to it in writing. Ethan's voice was flat and even and gave away nothing. Anything else? Briggs smiled. It was the same smile Clara had seen at the relay station, the one that knew it had all the time in the world. Spring auction's in 2 months, he said. Cattle prices are down. Might be worth thinking about which parcels are working hardest for you and which ones aren't. He touched his hat. Afternoon, Thompson. He rode away. Clara stayed at the kitchen window and watched him go and felt the cold, specific anger of a person who's being maneuvered and can see every move clearly and knows the board is still tilted against her. She went to the stove and stirred the pot. Lily came in from outside and said, "Who was that man?" "No one important," Clara said, which was the first lie she'd told in this house. Lily looked at her with the unsettling accuracy of a 5-year-old. "You don't look like he was no one important." "I'm fine, Lily." "Your stirring is angry." Clara put the spoon down. She turned and looked at her daughter. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "people come around who want things that aren't theirs to have. And when that happens, you don't show them they've bothered you, because that's what they're looking for." Lily considered this. Like when Billy Marsh took Lucy's hair ribbon and she cried and he laughed? Exactly like that. So you should have not reacted at him. "I didn't react. I stayed inside." Lily nodded slowly, like someone approving a tactical decision. "Good," she said, and went back outside. Clara looked at the door for a moment after her. Then she picked up the spoon and went back to the pot, and kept her stirring even, and thought about the meeting Ethan was going to call, and the 7 ranches, and Harlan Briggs on his horse smiling like a man who'd already won. He hadn't won yet. She wasn't done. The meeting happened on a Thursday evening, 10 days after Briggs rode away from the fence post with his easy smile and his careful threat about spring auctions and working parcels. Ethan had ridden out to each rancher individually, Calloway first, then the Marsh family, then the widow Denton and her son, and finally Art Foley, who'd taken the longest to convince and who'd said yes only after Ethan spent an hour sitting on his porch talking about nothing in particular, which was apparently what Art Foley needed before he could say yes to anything. Clara made coffee for 6 men and then took the twins upstairs and stayed there. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the low sound of voices through the floor. She couldn't make out words, only the general shape of the conversation, the flat, careful exchanges of men who didn't entirely trust each other, yet working towards something they all needed. She heard Ethan's voice most often, measured and direct, the voice of a man who wasn't trying to persuade anyone of anything except the plain facts. Lucy fell asleep early. Lily stayed awake. "What are they talking about?" Lily asked. "Business." "What kind?" "The kind that takes a while to fix." "Is it fixed yet?" "No." Lily was quiet for a moment. "How will we know when it is?" Clara looked at her daughter in the dim room. "Things will get quieter," she said. "That's usually how you know." She didn't believe that entirely, but it was the kind of answer a 5-year-old could sleep on, and Lily did. The men were there until almost 10. Clara heard them leave one by one, heard their horses and their wagons pulling out of the yard, heard the gate. When the house went fully quiet, she waited another 15 minutes before she came downstairs. Ethan was at the kitchen table with the coffee cups still around him and his hands flat on the wood, looking at nothing. He looked tired in a way that was different from the end-of-day tired she'd gotten used to. This was a thinking tired, the kind that came from managing people rather than managing land. She picked up the cups and set them in the basin without asking, and put water on, and sat down across from him. "How did it go?" she asked. "Calloway's in. Marsh family is in, though the older boy's nervous. Widow Denton said she'd been waiting for someone to call this meeting for 2 years. He paused. "Art Foley's behind on payment by 3 months now. He told me tonight. He was too embarrassed to say it before." "How far behind in money?" $40. $40 is manageable. Not for him right now. His wife's medical bills ate everything spare. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. I told him I'd cover the 40 against fall cattle money. He didn't want to take it. Did he take it? Eventually. Clara thought about Art Foley's saying eventually, about the specific pride of a man who needed help and couldn't ask for it cleanly, and she felt something like recognition. What about Rutherford, she asked. He's not coming. Because he thinks he has an arrangement with Briggs. He actually said, and I'm not making this up, he said Briggs is a reasonable man who just wants fair dealings. Ethan's jaw moved. Briggs wrote that clause into his loan same as everyone else's. Rutherford will learn that when it's too late to matter. Yes. He looked at his hands on the table. The agreement we reached tonight, we're going to approach the county land commissioner together, not separately, all of us. The clause Briggs wrote into the loan terms may not hold up under county review if it was never disclosed clearly. Mrs. Everts is willing to testify that the clause language was buried and not explained at signing. Clara leaned forward. She said that? I asked her before I called the meeting. She said, and I'm quoting, I've been watching that man operate for 12 years, and I've got a long memory and longer records. Clara felt something ease in her chest. When are you going to the commissioner? 2 weeks. Calloway knows him personally. That helps. It'll take time, even if they rule favorably. I know. Briggs will know something is moving before you get there. I know that too. So the next 2 weeks are when he's most likely to move. Ethan looked at her. That's what I think. She nodded. Then we make sure there's nothing to move against. She said it practically, the way she said most things, and only afterward saw something shift in his expression that she didn't immediately know how to read. Clara, he said. She waited. The thing he said when he came, about the association having opinions about household arrangements. I remember. I need to tell you what that actually means. He said it carefully, like a man handling something he didn't want to drop. Briggs has influence over 2 of the 3 board members. If he makes a formal complaint to the board that this household isn't operating under what he'd call proper arrangements, they can cite it as a violation of the loan's good standing clause and call the balance in 60 days. Clara sat with this. 60 days, she said. Yes. Can you raise $420 in 60 days? No. She'd known the answer. She'd asked it so there was no ambiguity between them about where they stood. What are our options? She said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the table, not at her, and she could see him working through something he'd already worked through and was uncomfortable arriving at again. There are 2, he said. One is you leave before he makes the formal complaint. Go somewhere he can't use you. And the second? He looked up. You stay. We marry. He has no complaint. The words sat between them on the kitchen table like a stone. Clara looked at him steadily. Is that a proposal? It's a description of a practical option. I know what it is. I'm asking how you mean it. He met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something in his face that wasn't the controlled, practical exterior he showed the world. Something less managed, something that cost him to let show. I don't want you to go, he said. I haven't wanted you to go since the first week, but I'm not going to say that and then dress it up as a business arrangement, because you deserve better than that, and because you'd see through it anyway. Clara was quiet. But I also know, he continued, that you came here for Samuel, and that I'm not Samuel, and this isn't what you planned for, and I don't expect you to feel something you don't feel just because the situation calls for it. So what are you actually saying? I'm saying I'd like to marry you, not for the ranch, not for the loan, because you are the most capable and clear-eyed person I have met in 10 years, and you have made this house feel like a house again, and I don't— He stopped. He looked like a man who'd gotten further into a sentence than he'd intended. I'm not good at this. I can see that. Does that— He stopped again. Ethan. She leaned forward slightly. Let me ask you something, and I want an honest answer. All right. If Briggs didn't exist, if there was no loan and no clause and no threat, would you be having this conversation right now? He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer of a kind. I don't know, he said finally. Maybe not tonight, maybe not yet. He held her gaze. But I think eventually, yes. I think I would have gotten there eventually. She believed him. Not because it was easy to believe, but because he was not a man who said things for effect, and she'd had 2 months to learn that about him. I need to think, she said. I know. This isn't a small thing. No. And I have 2 daughters to think about. I know that too. She pushed back from the table and stood. He stood when she did, reflex, the habit of a man who'd been raised with certain courtesies that had stuck even in 20 years of living alone. She found she didn't mind that about him. Give me until morning, she said. Take whatever time you need. She went upstairs and lay in the dark room with the sound of her daughter's breathing and thought about what she'd come here for and what she'd found instead, and whether those 2 things could be the same thing if she let them. She thought about her first husband, Thomas Whitmore, who she'd married at 19 and loved truly and lost at 31, and the particular grief of that, not the sharp edge of it, which had dulled with time, but the way it had left her permanently suspicious of certainty, permanently aware that the ground could go out from under you without notice. She thought about Ethan Thompson, who had fed her daughters bread and apples on their first night, and fixed fence wire with a cut hand, and turned garden soil for 20 minutes on a Wednesday morning without being asked, and sat in a room with 5 ranchers he didn't entirely trust, and made a plan to protect all of them. She thought about what he'd said. I don't want you to go. She thought, I don't want to go either. In the morning, before he went to the barn, she was already in the kitchen. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat down. He came in at 5:15 and stopped in the doorway, reading her. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. Just one. Controlled. But she heard the weight in it. We do this practically, she said. Quietly. Before Briggs can move. And after, we figure out the rest as we go. That's reasonable? I'm always reasonable. That's almost true, he said, which surprised a sound out of her that was very close to a laugh. They got married 6 days later, a Tuesday morning, in the parlor of the county clerk's office in Cole, with Mrs. Everts as a witness because Hattie Larson would have made too much noise about it, and they needed quiet. The clerk was a small, bespectacled man who read the words with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it many times and had decided long ago that the ceremony was the couple's business, and his job was just to make it legal. Clara wore her second-best dress. Ethan wore a clean shirt and had shaved, which she noticed. Lily and Lucy stood on either side of them and were, for approximately 4 minutes, the most well-behaved they had ever been in their lives. Afterward, on the walk back to the wagon, Lily said, Does this mean he's our papa now? Clara glanced at Ethan. He crouched down to Lily's level, which he did easily by now, a thing that had taken him the first 2 weeks to do naturally. If you want, he said. There's no rule that says you have to. Lily thought about this with the gravity she brought to important decisions. Lucy, who was holding Ethan's hand because she'd taken it at the start of the walk without commentary, looked up at him. I already decided, Lucy said. Did you? Yes, a while ago. He looked at her. When? When you showed me about the dirt colors. Clara watched her daughter's face and Ethan's face and felt something so full it was almost uncomfortable. All right then, Ethan said and stood up. They drove back to the ranch in the morning light, the twins between them on the wagon seat, and Clara thought, we will tell people this was practical. And it was. And it was also something else, something that didn't need a name yet, something she was willing to let grow at its own pace now that she'd stopped being afraid of it. The first thing Briggs did was nothing. That was the most dangerous version of Briggs, the one that sat still. Clara had expected something immediate when word reached him, because word always reached men like that fast. But a week passed, and then another, and the only sign was the absence of his name from anywhere. He wasn't at the general store when she went Friday, wasn't seen on the roads between the ranches, wasn't mentioned in the quiet updates Hattie brought with her Tuesday eggs. He's thinking, Clara said to Ethan one evening, or he's moving somewhere we can't see. Both, probably. The ranch in those 2 weeks had a surface calm that Clara refused to mistake for actual calm. She kept the accounts. She kept the records of every transaction, every payment, every communication with the association. She had Ethan write a formal letter to the land commissioner's office, requesting a review of the association loan structure, with Calloway's name on it alongside his, and she drafted it herself and had him read it 4 times before they sent it. It was during the 3rd week after the wedding that the trouble came, and it didn't come from Briggs directly. It never did with men like him. It came from Rutherford. Ed Rutherford was 60, heavy-set, with a ranch that ran along the south boundary of Ethan's property and a long history of believing himself to be in better standing than he was. Clara had never met him. She knew him through what Ethan said and what she'd pieced together from the community's careful non-comments whenever his name came up. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon when Ethan was out in the north pasture and Clara was in the garden with the twins. She heard the horse at the gate and stood up and shaded her eyes. He didn't dismount. "You the Thompson woman," he called. Clara walked to the gate. She left it closed between them. "I'm Clara Thompson," she said. "What can I do for you, Mr. Rutherford?" He looked down at her from the saddle with the expression of a man who was doing something he'd been convinced was his own idea. "You tell your husband that he's making a mistake with this commissioner business," Rutherford said. "He's going to make Briggs angry, and Briggs is going to come down on all of us." "Briggs is already coming down on all of you," Clara said. "Your loan has the same clause as everyone else's." Rutherford's face colored. "I have an arrangement. You don't." She said it flatly, not unkindly. "You think you do, but you don't. Briggs doesn't make arrangements he intends to keep. He makes arrangements that give him the next thing he needs." "You don't know him." "I've known men like him my whole life." She held his gaze through the gate. "If you go to him and tell him about the commissioner petition, he will thank you and promise you the arrangement holds and then call your loan when it's convenient for him. And you'll have burned your relationship with every other rancher in this county for nothing." Rutherford's jaw was tight. "That's not your business to say." "You came to my gate." "You made it my business." He stared at her for a moment. She stared back. She had learned a long time ago that most men who came at you from horseback were counting on you to look down first. She didn't. "Tell Thompson," he said, but the authority had gone out of it. "You can tell him yourself. He'll be back at sundown." Rutherford wheeled his horse and rode south without another word. Clara watched him go and then went back to the garden, and Lily, who had been watching from behind a tomato plant with the stillness she deployed when she was gathering information, said, "He was rude." "He was scared," Clara said. "Of you?" "Of the situation. He took it out on me because I was here and Ethan wasn't." Lily considered this. "That's stupid." "It's very common," Clara said, and went back to weeding. Ethan's reaction when she told him that evening was a long silence and then, "He'll go to Briggs." "I know. I couldn't stop him." "You were right about what you said. The arrangement isn't real." "I know that too. But he'll go anyway." "Yes. So we need to move the commissioner petition forward faster than we planned." He looked at her. Calloway's contact said the review would take. "I know what Calloway's contact said. I also know that Briggs now has someone going to him with the news that 7 ranchers have a joint petition in motion, and he's going to move before the review happens if he can." She spread the paper on the table, the ledger, the figures, the copies of the loan documents she'd made by hand over 3 evenings. "Is there any way to get a preliminary hearing, just to get the petition formally on record before he acts?" Ethan looked at the papers. "Calloway's in Sacramento next week." "Can he go sooner?" "I'll ask." "Tonight. Ride over tonight." He looked at her. There was a version of him, she thought, who might have bridled at that, at the directness, at being told what to do in his own kitchen. But that version of Ethan Thompson seemed to have concluded sometime in the last 6 weeks that her directness was a feature rather than a problem. "Tonight," he agreed, and got up and went to saddle the horse. He was back before midnight. She was still up, sitting by the lamp with the ledger, and he came in with mud on his boots and said without preamble, "Calloway goes to Sacramento Thursday." "Good. He wants you to write the formal summary. He says his letter writing is, his word was functional. I'll have it done by tomorrow evening." Ethan sat down. He looked at the paper she'd been working on and at her face in the lamplight, and he said, "Clara." "What?" "You've been up since 5. "I know. It's almost midnight." "I'm aware." He put his hand over hers on the table. Just for a moment. Not a performance of anything, just a hand. The summary will keep until morning, he said. She looked at their hands. She thought about all the practical reasons she'd said yes to him and wondered, as she increasingly wondered, how many of them were actually practical and how many were something she'd dressed in practical clothing because the other thing was harder to say. 1 more hour, she said. 1 more hour, he agreed, and got up to put water on, and sat across from her while she worked, and didn't say anything, and somehow that was better than being alone. The summary letter went to Sacramento with Calloway on Thursday. Clara had written it in plain language, no ornamentation, citing each clause by page number and paragraph, citing the 7 ranches by name and loan date, citing Mrs. Everts as a witness to the signing conditions. She'd had Ethan read it twice and he'd changed 2 words, both good changes, and she'd put them in. She did not hear from Calloway for 11 days. In those 11 days, the ranch continued. The cattle needed moving to the east pasture, which was a 2-day job that left Ethan coming home exhausted and sunburned. The garden came in with more tomatoes than she'd expected, which meant 2 days of canning that she did with Hattie, who arrived Tuesday, as always, and rolled up her sleeves without being asked. Ada came that day too, and the 3 women worked the kitchen together, and it was hot and loud and Clara's back hurt by afternoon, and it was also one of the better days she could remember in a long time. Lucy decided she wanted to learn to write her name and practiced it 40 times on the back of an old receipt until it was legible from more than 2 feet away. Lily learned that she could get the smallest barn cat to follow her if she dragged a piece of string, and spent 3 afternoons doing this with a focus and patience that Clara found both impressive and slightly alarming. Processing something. He knew that when she went very still and very efficient, she was angry. They had not talked again about what he'd said that night at the kitchen table. I'd like to marry you, not for the ranch. And they hadn't needed to. It lived in the house with them, that conversation, patient as a thing that knows it has time. On the 12th day, a letter came from Sacramento. Ethan brought it in from the road where the postal rider had left it at the box. He set it on the kitchen table without opening it and looked at Clara. You open it, he said. It's addressed to you. You wrote the letter that made it happen. Open it. She picked it up and opened it. The county land commissioner's office would conduct a preliminary review of the association loan terms in question. A hearing was scheduled for October 14th. All 7 parties were requested to appear, either in person or by signed statement. The clause in question had been flagged as potentially non-compliant with county lending regulations established in 1859. Clara read it twice. Then she set it down on the table. Ethan read it standing up. She watched his face while he read, the careful blankness he kept while processing, and then, when he reached the last paragraph, something that broke through. October 14th, he said. 6 weeks. He'll know before the week is out. Yes. This is the window, when he's most, I know. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. What do you need from me? He said. It was such a direct question, asked so plainly that for a moment she just looked at him. Keep the ranchers from panicking, she said. Rutherford is already gone, but the others need to hold steady for 6 weeks. Don't let anyone make a separate deal with Briggs out of fear. If he approaches anyone individually, I'll ride to each of them this week. Make sure they know the hearing is scheduled. Don't tell them everything is going to be fine. I don't know that it will be. No, but more importantly, they won't believe you if you say it, and then they'll trust you less. She picked up the letter and folded it. Tell them the truth. The petition is on record. The commissioner is reviewing. 6 weeks, and we'll know. He nodded. He was watching her with that look again, the one she'd decided was him recalculating. What? She said. Nothing. Ethan. He shook his head, but something was in his face that he didn't try very hard to hide. I just think, he said, that Samuel had better instincts than I gave him credit for. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her that she didn't put a name to. Go ride to Calloway, she said, before the news gets there before you. He went. She stood in the kitchen with the commissioner's letter in her hands, and through the window she could see the garden coming in full and green, and she could hear the twins somewhere in the yard arguing about something that would resolve itself in under 5 minutes, as it always did, and the late September light was coming in long and gold across the kitchen floor. She thought about the night she'd arrived, the relay station, Briggs's flat, dismissive eyes, the 4 miles of dirt road with a bag and 2 tired children, the gate at the fence, Ethan coming out of the barn and stopping. She thought about how much had been built in 3 months out of nothing but necessity and stubbornness and whatever it was that existed between 2 people who told each other the truth. 6 weeks to the hearing, 6 weeks for Briggs to move. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the wooden box with the loan documents and the ledger and Mrs. Everts's figures and the copies of everything, because she had learned a long time ago that the paper was as important as the act, and she was not going to walk into that hearing without every piece of evidence she had in order. She went back to work. That evening, after the twins were in bed and Ethan had returned from Calloway's with the news that Calloway was steady and Marsh was steady, and Widow Denton had said, reportedly, "Good, it's about time," Clara was washing the last dishes in the basin when she heard Ethan come to stand in the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn around. "Did you eat at Calloway's?" she asked. "Margaret fed me." "How's her hip?" "Better," she says. She finished the last cup and set it on the cloth and dried her hands. Outside, the night was clear and getting cold in the way that October came in. The first genuine cold of it, the kind that reminded you winter was not a rumor. "Ethan," she said. "Yes." She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her with the quiet attention she'd grown used to, that particular way he had of being fully present to whatever was in front of him. "What you said," she said, "the night before we married, that you didn't know if you'd have gotten there without the pressure of Briggs, but that you thought, eventually, I remember. I want to say something about that." He waited. "I think I was already there," she said, "before you said it. I just wasn't ready to know it yet." He was very still. "I'm not saying it to be romantic," she said. "I'm saying it because you were honest with me, and I want to be honest with you. We built this on plain speaking. I don't want to change that." "I don't either." "Good." She picked up the lamp from the counter. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night," he said, and his voice had something in it that she didn't examine too closely because she was already walking past him to the stairs, and some things were better approached gradually, at their own pace, without rushing. She went upstairs. Behind her, the kitchen was quiet. The house held its breath the way houses did at the end of a full day. Everything settled and accounted for, every person under the roof present and safe. It was a feeling she hadn't known in years, that particular kind of quiet. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed it until she was standing in the middle of it again. 6 weeks, she thought. 6 weeks, and they would know. She went to check on her daughters and then to her room and slept without dreaming. Briggs moved on a Monday, which Clara had not predicted. She'd expected a weekend, when officials were harder to reach and news traveled slower. But Briggs had been doing this longer than she'd been watching him, and he understood that Monday had its own logic. The start of a week, people not yet in their rhythm, the commissioner's office still sorting the previous week's correspondence. The notice arrived by rider at 7 in the morning. Ethan was already in the barn. Clara took the envelope from the rider at the door, thanked him with a steadiness she didn't feel, and stood in the kitchen and opened it. It was a formal demand letter from the Land Association Board. On the basis of a complaint filed by a board member, unnamed, citing irregularities in the property's operating status and outstanding concerns regarding the loan's good standing, the board was requesting full payment of the balance due within 45 days. $412. The subdivision clause was cited on page 2. Clara read it twice. Then she set it flat on the table and stood with her hands on either side of it and breathed. 45 days. Not 60. 45 because Briggs had enough board influence to shorten the standard window, and because the hearing was in 6 weeks and he was cutting the margin to nothing. She heard Ethan's boots on the porch and turned to the stove, not because there was anything urgent there, but because she needed 2 seconds to arrange her face before she showed him the letter. She gave herself 1 second and turned around. "There's a letter," she said. He read it standing at the table, coat still on, the way he'd read the commissioner's letter, and she watched his face do the same controlled blank and then tighten at the jaw. He set it down. 45 days, he said. The hearing is in 42. He looked at her. She saw him do the arithmetic. 3 days, he said. If the commissioner rules in our favor at the hearing, Briggs's complaint collapses. But he'll know that too, which means he'll try to delay the hearing, challenge the petition standing, or find some other... He'll go after the other ranchers. Ethan picked up the letter again, not reading it, just holding it. If he can get one of them to pull out of the petition before October 14th, he undermines the joint nature of the complaint. Art Foley, Clara said. Foley's most vulnerable. I know. You need to go to him today. Yes. He set the letter down again. He looked at the table, then at her. What do we do about the money? We don't have it. I know we don't have it. I'm asking what we do. Clara sat down. Because standing was beginning to feel like a performance of composure she couldn't entirely afford. We don't pay it, she said. If we pay it, we're validating the demand and the process, and we've lost before the hearing starts. The demand is retaliatory, and Briggs knows it. Our lawyer. We don't have a lawyer. Calloway's contact in Sacramento, the one who helped with the petition. Does he practice? Ethan thought for a moment. He's a clerk, not... Does he know a lawyer? Probably. Then Calloway needs to ride today, too. We need someone who can file a response to this demand within the week, formally, on record, citing the pending hearing as grounds to stay the collection. She looked at her hands on the table. If we can get the response filed, Briggs has to wait for the hearing anyway. He doesn't have legitimate grounds to move before the commissioner rules. Ethan was quiet for a moment, looking at her. You worked this out while I was reading the letter, he said. I worked most of it out at 2 a.m. 4 days ago when I couldn't sleep and started thinking about what he'd do when he moved. Something crossed his face. Not amusement exactly, but adjacent to it. You couldn't sleep 4 days ago, and you didn't say anything. I was hoping I was wrong. He pushed back from the table. I'll ride to Foley first, then Calloway. Take the copy of the petition and the commissioner's letter. Show Foley what's at stake if he pulls out. He knows what's at stake. He knows abstractly. Fear makes things abstract feel distant, and the immediate thing feel overwhelming. Show him the paper, make it concrete again. Ethan put his hat on. At the door he stopped. Clara. She looked up. You all right? The question surprised her, not because it was strange to ask, but because of the way he asked it. Not as a courtesy, not as something said on the way out the door, but as an actual inquiry, with actual interest in the answer. Not entirely, she said honestly. He nodded. I'll be back by dark. He left, and Clara sat in the kitchen with the demand letter on the table, and the twins not yet awake upstairs, and the morning coming in gray through the window, and she let herself sit in the discomfort of it for exactly 5 minutes. She'd learned to do that, to allow the feeling its time rather than push it down, because pushing it down just meant it came out sideways later when she couldn't afford it. 5 minutes. Then she got up and made coffee and started breakfast, and went upstairs to wake her daughters, because the ranch had to run, and the accounts had to be kept, and the garden had one more harvest before the cold set in, and Harlan Briggs did not get to stop any of that simply because he'd sent a letter. Art Foley's wife was worse. Ethan came back at dusk with mud on his boots and a look that told Clara the day had been harder than expected. He sat at the table and she put food in front of him and he ate slowly, the way a man ate when he was thinking about something other than the food. Eleanor Foley is bedridden, he said. She's been bad since last month, but Art didn't say. He pushed the plate slightly. He's been alone out there, managing her and the ranch and the payments and not telling anyone. Clara thought about a man managing all of that in silence. She recognized the shape of it. Did he hold? She asked. He held, but Clara... He's not going to make it to October 14th if he's hit with a similar demand letter. He doesn't have the margins. He looked at her. Briggs knows Eleanor is sick. He knows what it costs. Of course he knows. If he sends a demand to Foley, he will. Art might take whatever settlement Briggs offers just to make it stop. Clara thought. She turned her cup in her hands, watching the lamp. What does Art Foley need to keep his head above water until the hearing? She said. Maybe $60, maybe $70, enough to cover Eleanor's care and the next payment and have something left over that isn't desperation. We have 40 in savings. That's not... I know. She looked at him. What about Calloway? Widow Denton? Ethan was quiet. I know it's asking a lot, she said. These people aren't family, they're neighbors, and not all of them close ones. But if Briggs gets to Foley and Foley breaks, the joint petition loses one of its strongest cases. Foley's loan has the worst disclosure record. Mrs. Everett said so. He's the example that makes the commissioner take the whole thing seriously. You want me to ask Calloway and Denton to put money toward Foley's situation. I want you to explain what's at stake if he falls out of the petition, and see if they reach the same conclusion you and I already have. Ethan looked at her for a long time. Then he said, You know what the county will say about this? Ranchers pooling money to keep a petition going. Briggs will say we're conspiring. Briggs will say whatever he needs to say. That doesn't make it true, and it doesn't make it something the commissioner will act on. She held his gaze. We're not doing anything wrong, Ethan. We're protecting people from a predatory lending clause that was never properly disclosed. If we have to help each other to do it, that's not conspiracy. That's just people. He nodded slowly. I'll ride to Calloway tomorrow morning. I'll write a letter to go with you, setting out the numbers, what Foley needs and why. They may say no. They may, but we ask. She picked up his empty plate. Did you eat at Foley's? Eleanor insisted on feeding me. She could barely sit up, and she insisted. Clara stood at the basin with the plate and didn't say anything for a moment. She was thinking about Eleanor Foley, who she'd never met, sick in a bed on a struggling ranch, and who apparently still insisted on feeding visitors. She found she felt something fierce and specific about that woman. When this is over, she said without turning around, I'd like to go meet Eleanor Foley. She'd probably like that too, Ethan said. Calloway gave $30. Widow Denton gave $25 and a side of cured pork that she sent with Ethan in the wagon. The Marsh family gave $15 and a dozen jars of preserved vegetables and an apology that it wasn't more, which Ethan told them was already more than enough. Clara added their $40. It came to $110, plus the food, which was worth another $15 or $20 in practical terms. Ethan drove it to the Foley Ranch on a Wednesday, with Clara beside him and the twins in the back because there was no one to leave them with, and also because Lucy had asked to come with a persistence that had outlasted every reasonable objection. Eleanor Foley was in her 50s, thin now in the way illness made people thin, but with eyes that were still sharp and a voice that was steady when she used it. She was sitting up in the front room when they arrived, wrapped in quilts, with the specific dignity of a woman who had decided she was going to receive visitors properly, regardless of circumstance. Clara sat with her while Ethan talked to Art in the other room. The twins sat on the floor with a quietness that Clara suspected was less about manners and more about the instinctive recognition children sometimes had of a room that required it. Your husband tells Art you wrote the petition summary, Eleanor said. I put it in order, Claire said. The substance was everyone's. Don't do that, Clara looked at her. Don't make yourself smaller, Eleanor said. I've been doing it my whole life, and it's a bad habit. She pulled the quilt up slightly. Art says you came here with nothing and sorted out what Briggs was doing in 3 weeks. That's not putting it in order. That's seeing something no one else was looking at. Clara was quiet for a moment. I had a reason to look. We all had reasons. We just didn't. Eleanor glanced toward the door, toward the sound of her husband's voice in the next room. Art is a good man. He works hard. He doesn't always see the pattern in things the way you do. He sees the piece in front of him. She paused. I'm glad someone saw the whole board. From the floor, Lucy said, without looking up from the toys she'd been given. Mama always sees the whole board. Eleanor looked at Lucy with a smile that changed her face entirely. How old are you? 5. Almost 5.5. And your sister? Also 5, but she's loud about it. From across the room, Lily said without turning around. I heard that. Eleanor laughed, a real one, and it cost her something. Clara could see that, but she didn't stop it. You have good girls, she said. They have their moments, Clara said, and Eleanor laughed again, smaller. They drove back in the late afternoon, the twins asleep in the wagon bed within the first mile. The road back to the Thompson ranch, gold and long in the October light. Ethan drove, and Clara sat beside him, and neither of them said much for a while. "She's not going to get better," Clara said eventually. "No. Art knows." "Yes. He's doing all of this. The petition holding on for the ranch. Because it's what he'll have after." "That's my read." Clara looked at the road ahead. "Then we make sure he keeps it." Ethan didn't respond immediately. After a moment he said, "When this is over, however it goes." He paused, and she could hear him deciding how to put something. "What do you want? For yourself. Not the ranch, not the hearing. What do you want next?" It was such an unexpected question that she didn't answer immediately. No one had asked her that in a long time. She'd been asked what she needed, what she could do, what she was willing to manage, not what she wanted. "I want the garden to come back well next year," she said. "I want the twins to have somewhere stable long enough to stop bracing for the next move." She looked at the road. "I want—" She stopped. "What?" "I want to stop being afraid that the ground is going to go out from under me," she said. "I know that's not a thing you can just have. I know you earn it over time, if you're lucky." She turned to look at him. "But that's what I want." He held the reins and looked at the road and said, "You've been afraid of that since you got here." "Since before I got here." "I know." He was quiet a moment. "I don't know how to promise the ground won't move. I've had it move under me enough times to know better than to promise. I'm not asking for a promise. But I can tell you that whatever moves, I'll still be standing next to you on it." He said it the way he said most significant things, plainly, without architecture around it, without waiting to see how it landed. "For whatever that's worth." Clara looked at him for a moment. The light was behind him, and she couldn't see his face entirely, but she knew it well enough by now to know what it looked like when he meant something. "It's worth a lot," she said. He nodded once. They drove the rest of the way home in a silence that was not empty. Osh. The week before the hearing, Briggs sent demand letters to 3 of the other ranchers. Calloway, Marsh, and Widow Denton all received the same document Clara had received, worded identically, same 45-day window, same subdivision clause citation. Calloway responded immediately, because Calloway had the Sacramento contact and knew the process. Marsh took 2 days to respond and needed Ethan to write out and explain what the response should say. Widow Denton wrote her own response, a single page that her son brought to Ethan with some bewilderment because it was, he reported, extremely direct. "What did she say?" Clara asked. Ethan read it to her. It cited the pending hearing, cited the lack of full disclosure at signing, cited 12 years of on-time payments as proof of good standing, and closed with a sentence informing the board that she would be at the hearing personally and would welcome the opportunity to explain her position to the commissioner in her own words. "I like her," Clara said. "Everyone likes her. That's why she's useful." Clara organized all the responses into a folder. She had built, over the past weeks, a kind of case file that lived in the wooden box alongside the original loan documents. Every letter, every response, every note from Mrs. Everts, the commissioner's scheduling confirmation, the figures from each rancher's loan status. She had cross-referenced everything twice. She knew that file the way she knew the garden rows, by instinct and repetition and the specific satisfaction of things being where you'd put them. 3 days before the hearing, Rutherford came back. He came in the evening this time, and Ethan was home, and Clara stayed in the kitchen while they talked on the porch. Not because she'd been asked to, but because the conversation was going to go better without her in it, and she knew it. She could hear them through the window, not every word but the shape of it. Rutherford's voice was different from the last time. The bluster had come out of it. What was underneath was something closer to a man who'd been shown something he didn't want to see and was now trying to figure out what to do with the knowledge. He was in there for 20 minutes. When Ethan came inside, he stood at the kitchen counter and said, "Briggs sent him a demand letter." "I expected that." "He came to see if we'd take him into the petition." "Can he be added this close to the hearing?" "Calloway's contact says there's a process. It'll take an amendment to the filing." He looked at her. "What do you think?" "I think Rutherford made a bad bet, and he knows it, and he's scared." She turned the matter over. "I also think his loan is one of the older ones, with different documentation than the others. And if he's added to the petition, it gives the commissioner a broader pattern to look at. So we add him. I think we add him. But Ethan, he needs to understand that his information about the petition may have gotten to Briggs. Yes, he needs to say that plainly, and he needs to accept that some of the other ranchers are going to be angry about it, and he needs to accept that anyway. She paused. Is he capable of doing that? Ethan thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. I think so. He's not a bad man. He's a man who believed what was convenient to believe. Most of us have been that at some point. You haven't. You don't know me well enough to say that. I know you well enough, he said, and something in the way he said it made her look up at him, and he met her eyes with a steadiness that had stopped surprising her and started being something she depended on. Tell Rutherford yes, she said. Tell him to be at Calloway's tomorrow morning. I'll have the amendment drafted by tonight. She worked until nearly 11. The twins had been in bed since 8. Ethan had fallen asleep in the chair in the front room around 9:30, which she'd let happen because the man had been riding from ranch to ranch for 2 weeks, and he needed the sleep more than he needed the bed. She covered him with the quilt from the chest by the door and went back to the kitchen table and kept working. The amendment was 4 pages. She was accurate and she was thorough, and she did not allow herself to think about what happened if the commissioner ruled against them, because that was the thing she would deal with if it came and not a moment before. She finished at 11:15, read it through one more time, and put it in the wooden box. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet house, listening to the sound of Ethan breathing in the next room, steady and slow, and the barely audible sounds of the twins upstairs, and outside the October wind beginning to come up. She thought, this is the thing I wanted. This. Right here. Not the hearing, not the outcome, not the security on the other side of it. This specific evening with the lamp low and the case file in the box and the people she'd found herself responsible for all under one roof, safe for the night. She put the lamp out and went upstairs and didn't let herself think past the morning. October 14th arrived with fog. They drove to the county seat, which was not Cole, but the larger town of Morrow, 18 miles east. In 2 wagons, the Thompsons in one, the twins bundled in the back, and Calloway and his wife following behind. The Marsh family had come in the night before and stayed in Morrow. Widow Denton's son drove her in his wagon and was reportedly still not sure he entirely understood what they were doing, but trusted his mother. Art Foley came alone, Eleanor too unwell to travel, and he arrived in Morrow looking like a man who hadn't slept well in 2 weeks, which was probably accurate. Rutherford came. Clara had not been certain he would. She'd told Ethan the night before that there was a 30% chance he'd lose his nerve before morning, and Ethan had said he thought it was higher than that, and they'd argued about it quietly in the way they argued, both making a case, both actually listening to the other side. She'd put him at 30, he'd put him at 50, and they'd agreed to see. He came. So they were both wrong, which happened. The commissioner's office was in a building that smelled of paper and wood smoke, and the particular dry air of a room that processed official things. The commissioner was a man named Aldous Heck, 60 or so, with a gray beard and the expression of someone who'd heard many people tell him many things and had developed a careful patience about all of it. Clara was not at the table. None of the wives were. This was how it was. She'd known it walking in and she'd made her peace with it, or as close to peace as she could manage. She and Hattie, who had appeared at the county seat without anyone quite being clear on who'd told her about the hearing, sat in the chairs along the wall and watched. Ethan presented their case. He was not a polished speaker, which she'd worried about and which turned out not to matter, because he was a precise one. He knew the documents she'd prepared well enough to cite them without looking down more than twice, and he laid out the sequence, the clause, the disclosure, Mrs. Everts's testimony, the pattern of loans, the timing of Briggs's demand letters relative to the petition filing, with the directness of a man describing something he'd watched happen and didn't intend to let continue. Calloway spoke after him. Widow Denton spoke, and she was, as Clara had expected, extremely direct. Briggs was present with 2 of his board members and a lawyer named Sutter, who had come from Sacramento and who made 3 procedural objections in the first hour, all of which Commissioner Heck noted and none of which he ruled on immediately. Lawyer Sutter was smooth and practiced and argued that the clause was standard industry language that any borrower reviewing the loan should have understood. He said the demand letters were within the board's rights. He said the petition was a coordinated effort to interfere with legitimate lending operations. Clara watched Commissioner Heck during all of this. She'd learned to watch listeners, not speakers, in the boarding house. You learned more from the person being talked to than from the person talking. Heck listened to Sutter with the same careful patience he'd brought to the rancher's testimony, but there was something in the way he handled his pen that changed slightly during the procedural objections, a micro-movement of controlled irritation, and she filed it away. Then Mrs. Everts testified. She had come in the same dress she wore on Fridays when Clara saw her, the same practical shoes, the same self-contained air. She sat in the chair before Commissioner Heck, and she produced her records, 22 years of them, tied in bundles. And she walked through the loan signings she had witnessed, and she said, in the flat, direct language of a woman who had kept her own counsel for 2 decades and had finally been given a reason to use it publicly, that the subdivision clause had never been explained to any borrower in her presence, and that she had asked Harlan Briggs directly at one signing what the clause meant, and had been told it was standard protective language that would never be invoked in normal circumstances. The room was very quiet. Sutter objected. Heck noted it. Briggs, across the room, was looking at a point on the wall above everyone's heads with the expression of a man recalculating from a long way back. The hearing took 4 hours. At the end, Commissioner Heck said he would take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within 30 days. 30 days. Not today. Clara had known this was likely and had prepared herself for it, but the knowing and the experiencing were different, and she sat with the weight in her chest as they filed out of the building into the cold October afternoon. Ethan found her by the wagons. 30 days, he said. I know. What did you think of Heck? He didn't like Sutter's procedural objections. I saw that too. And he asked Briggs directly if he'd explained the clause at signing. Briggs said it was explained generally. And Heck wrote something down when he said that. They looked at each other. We wait, Clara said. We wait, he agreed. Art Foley came over to them, hat in hand. He looked wrung out and a little lighter simultaneously, the expression of a man who'd been carrying something heavy and had just set half of it down. Thank you, he said to Ethan. Then he looked at Clara. Both of you. Thank Mrs. Everts, Clara said. She was the one who changed the room. I intend to. He put his hat back on. I need to get back to Eleanor. Of course, Ethan said. Foley climbed into his wagon and drove east, and Clara watched him go and thought about Eleanor and her quilts in the front room and hoped the day would get back to her in some form that gave her something to hold on to. Calloway organized a brief gathering at the hotel in Morrow, just the ranchers and their wives, coffee, and a few words. The kind of gathering that wasn't a celebration because nothing was decided yet, but that acknowledged the day had been something. Clara sat with Widow Denton's son, who turned out to be 24 and forthcoming once he'd had something to drink, and who told her his mother had been waiting for a reason to say that to Briggs's lawyer for 12 years. She practiced it, he said, the testimony. She practiced it out loud in the kitchen for a week. Clara looked across the room at Widow Denton, who was drinking coffee and talking to Calloway's wife with the same directness she brought to everything. It showed, Clara said, in the best way. On the drive home, the twins fell asleep as reliably as they always did in a moving wagon, and the road back was dark and cold, and the stars were out in the way they came out in October, more than you remembered from summer, too many to count. Ethan drove and Clara sat beside him, and she was tired in a way that had gone all the way through her, the bone-deep tired of sustained effort finally pausing. Whatever Heck decides, she said. Yes. We did what we could do. We did. I mean that as a real statement, not a consolation. We had the information, we organized it, we got the right people in the room. If it doesn't go our way, it won't be for lack of trying. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You know what I noticed today? What? Heck asked Briggs when the clause was first introduced to the association's loan templates. Briggs said 1859. Clara turned to look at him. Same year he started buying up the parcels along the water channel, Ethan said. Heck wrote something down when Briggs said it. Then he checked a date in his file. Clara thought about this. You think Heck already knew? I think Heck may have had his own questions about Briggs before we walked in. She turned back to the road. The horses moved steadily through the dark, and the ranch was still a few miles out, and in the back the twins slept with the complete unconscious trust of children who believed the people driving them knew the way home. Then we may have given him what he needed to act, she said. Maybe. We'll know in 30 days. We'll know in 30 days, he said. Clara put her hands in her lap and looked at the dark road and let herself, carefully and without making a production of it, feel something close to hope. Not certainty, not relief. Just the specific, fragile, worth-protecting thing that was hope, held loosely, the way you held something you'd learned not to grip too hard. 30 days. She'd waited longer for harder things. She could wait 30 days. The 30 days were the longest of Clara's life, and she'd had some long ones. She managed them the way she managed most things, by staying in motion. The garden got its final fall harvest, every last tomato and squash, and the dried bean pods she'd let go to seed for next year. She put up 17 jars of tomatoes and 11 of mixed vegetables and 4 of the berry preserves she'd made from the last of the summer fruit, and she stacked them in the cellar in neat rows and felt, looking at them, the specific satisfaction of preparation. Whatever came, they would eat. The account stayed current. She kept the ledger with the same precision she'd kept it since September. Every transaction recorded the day it happened, every receipt in the wooden box. She didn't know if the ledger would matter in 30 days, but she kept it because the habit of accuracy was the thing, not the particular purpose it served at any given moment. Ethan rode to the neighboring ranches twice in the first 2 weeks. Not because anything required it, but because the waiting was harder on some of the others than it was on them. And Ethan understood that presence was sometimes the thing people needed when there was nothing practical left to offer. He came home from Art Foley's the second time and said that Eleanor had taken a bad turn and then steadied, and that Art was sleeping 4 hours a night and wouldn't be told to sleep more. Is there anything we can do? Clara asked. I left him the extra grain from the south shed. He said he didn't need it. I left it anyway. She nodded. That was the right call. Some people needed to refuse a thing before they could accept it, and the trick was to leave it where they could find it after. The twins, who had absorbed the household's tension without being given specifics, expressed this absorption in the way 5-year-olds did, through an increased frequency of conflict over things that didn't matter. Lily and Lucy argued about whose turn it was to feed the barn cat, about which side of the bed was whose, about whether a particular cloud looked like a horse or a dog, with an intensity that was not really about cats or beds or clouds. Clara let most of it run its course. She intervened when it escalated past a certain point and not before, because she'd learned that settling every argument before it finished was its own kind of problem. They never learned to get through the end of a thing on their own. One evening she found them in the barn, both crying, in a standoff that had apparently begun over the ownership of a piece of rope and had progressed to a comprehensive airing of grievances about fairness in general. She sat down in the hay and looked at them. Are you done? She asked. No, said Lily. Almost, said Lucy. Take your time. She waited. They looked at her with the particular suspicion of children who expected intervention and received patience instead, which was always more disorienting to them. After a moment, Lily said, It's not really about the rope. I know. Are we going to have to leave? There it was. The real thing, the thing underneath the rope and the cat and the clouds. I don't know yet, Clara said. But I want you to listen to me about something. They came and sat on either side of her in the hay, which was where they always ended up when she had something to say. We've had to leave places before, she said. Ohio, the boarding house, the stage. We don't like leaving, Lucy said. I know, neither do I. But here's the thing I want you to remember. Every time we've had to leave somewhere, we've ended up somewhere. We've never ended up nowhere. Do you understand what I mean? Lily thought about this carefully. Like a stepping stone, she said. You have to step off one to get to the next one. Exactly like that. But what if there isn't a next stone? Lucy asked. There has always been a next stone, Clara said. Even when I couldn't see it, it was there. Lucy leaned against her arm. I don't want to leave here. I know. Ethan showed me how the dirt changes color when it rains, she said, with the gravity of someone citing an irreplaceable education. I haven't learned everything about it yet. Clara put her arm around her. Then let's hope we stay long enough for you to finish learning. They stayed in the hay for a while, the three of them, while the barn cat came and wound itself around Lily's legs and seemed to settle the question of the rope permanently, and outside the October dark came down over the ranch and the stars emerged one at a time in the cold, clear sky. Bob. The ruling came on a Thursday, the 12th of November, 29 days after the hearing. The postal rider came at 8 in the morning, and this time Ethan was in the kitchen when the knock came and he went to the door himself. Clara stood at the stove and heard the paper change hands and heard the door close and did not turn around. She heard him open the envelope. She heard him read. The silence stretched long enough that she finally turned. He was standing at the kitchen table with the letter in his hands, and his face had done something she hadn't seen it do before. It had let go of the controlled exterior completely, all of it, and what was underneath was a man who had been holding himself braced for a long time and had just been told he could stop. Well, she said. He looked up. The subdivision clause has been ruled non-compliant with county lending regulations. All 7 loans, including Rutherford's, are to be restructured under standard terms within 90 days. The demand letters issued in October are void. The association board is under review. He paused. Briggs has 30 days to respond to a formal inquiry into his lending practices since 1859. Clara put her hand on the back of the nearest chair. That last part, she said. The inquiry. Mrs. Everett's testimony, and apparently the commissioner's office had received 2 previous complaints about the association over the years that hadn't gone anywhere individually. He set the letter on the table. Together, they went somewhere. She looked at the letter on the table, 4 pages. The whole weight of the last 3 months sitting there in official ink. We need to get word to the others, she said. I know. Foley first. Foley first, he agreed. She was already untying her apron. I'll come with you. He looked at her. Not surprised, just confirming. The twins. Hattie's Tuesday visit is in 2 hours. I'll leave a note. 20 minutes later, they were on the road, the wagon moving at a pace that was faster than practical and slower than they wanted to go. Clara sat beside him with the commissioner's letter in the wooden box on her lap. She'd brought the whole box, every document, because after 3 months of building the case, she wasn't leaving any of it at home today. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of November morning that felt recently cleaned, the hills brown and gold, the sky that deep October into November blue that didn't last long before winter gray came in and replaced it. Ethan, she said. Yes. When it's finished, when the restructuring is done and the inquiry runs its course, what happens to Briggs? He thought about it honestly. He loses the board, loses the administrative control over the loans, may lose more than that depending on what the inquiry finds. He kept his eyes on the road. He won't be ruined, probably. Men like him rarely are. But he'll be smaller. Smaller is enough, Clara said. I'm not looking for ruined. I just want him unable to do what he's been doing. That's what this does. She looked at the road ahead. I thought I'd feel differently, she said. I thought there'd be more to it. What do you feel? She considered it honestly. Tired, she said, and glad, and ready to think about something else. He glanced at her. What do you want to think about instead? The south fence needs work before winter. The twins need new boots again. Lucy's worn through the left heel, which I believe she gets from me, and I'd like to get more seed catalogs before spring so we can plan the garden properly this time, instead of in a hurry. He was quiet for a moment. Those are all practical things. I'm a practical person. You are. He said it without irony, with something that was closer to admiration than she always knew how to receive. Is there anything you want that isn't practical? She looked at him sideways. He was watching the road, but she could see from the set of his jaw that he was listening the same way he always listened, fully, without performing it. I want to go somewhere next summer, she said. Not for business, just to go. Take the twins somewhere they haven't been. The coast, maybe. We've never been to the coast? I know. Any of us. That's rather the point. He thought about this, and she watched a slow thing happen on his face, something relaxing that had been held tight for months, possibly years. We'll go to the coast, he said, after the south fence. After the south fence. Malchit. Art Foley was in his yard when they arrived, splitting wood with the mechanical focus of a man who needed to keep his hands busy, and he stopped when he saw the wagon and stood holding the axe, and watched them pull in with an expression that was trying not to be hopeful and failing. Ethan got down and walked to him and handed him the letter. Clara stayed in the wagon and watched Art Foley read. She watched his face the way she'd watched Commissioner Heck's face at the hearing, reading the listener rather than the text. She saw him get to the ruling. She saw his jaw work. He read it again from the beginning, and when he finished the second read, he put his face in one hand for a moment, still holding the letter in the other, and stood there in his yard in the November morning, just breathing. Ethan stood next to him and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. After a while, Art lifted his head. His eyes were red but dry, the eyes of a man who decided he was going to hold together and was holding together. Eleanor, he said. Go tell her, Ethan said. Art looked at the letter, then at Ethan, then at Clara in the wagon. He nodded at her, a real nod, the kind that meant more than courtesy. She nodded back. He went inside. They waited in the yard. After a few minutes, they heard, faintly through the wall of the house, Eleanor Foley's voice. Not the words, just the sound of it, and then a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something that couldn't decide between laughing and crying and had given up and become both. Clara looked at the bare November trees at the edge of the Foley property and felt something move through her that she couldn't put in words and didn't try. They stopped at Calloway's, then Marsh's, then sent a rider to Widow Denton since her place was furthest. They found Rutherford at the general store in Cole. He'd come for supplies, unaware, and Ethan told him there in the street in front of Mrs. Everett's counter, and Rutherford went through several expressions in about 15 seconds and landed on something that looked like a man who'd been given a second chance he knew he didn't entirely deserve. I should have come to you sooner, Rutherford said. Yes, Ethan said, not unkindly, but plainly. Rutherford looked at Clara. I said some things to you that weren't right. You did, Clara said. I'd like to... Mr. Rutherford, keep your ranch well and treat your neighbors fairly, and we'll call it settled. She picked up the canned goods she'd come in for. That's all I want from anyone. He stood there looking like a man who'd expected harder terms and wasn't sure what to do with easier ones. Mrs. Everett's, behind the counter, said nothing, but she stamped Clara's receipt with the same decisive force she'd been stamping it with for 3 months. And when Clara looked at her, she gave a single nod that was worth more than anything Rutherford had said. Winter came in hard that year, the way California winters sometimes did. Rain driving in off the coast in November and settling into a long, cold, gray December that kept everyone closer to home than they wanted to be. The ranch contracted into itself the way ranches did in winter. The work smaller in circumference, more intensive in the space it occupied, feeding and maintaining and waiting for the season to turn. The twins grew. Clara noticed it in the way she noticed most things about them. Not in a single moment, but in accumulation. One day finding that Lily's coat was too short in the sleeve. Another day hearing Lucy sound out a word from the newspaper without help, and then look up with an expression of pure, startled pride. Ethan taught them to play cards on winter evenings, a simple game that Clara suspected he'd simplified specifically for them and that they played with a competitive intensity that regularly shocked him. She cheated, Lily said, pointing at Lucy. I didn't cheat, Lucy said. I just remembered what you put down. That's cheating. That's memory. Lily, Ethan said. She's right. Remembering what's been played isn't cheating, it's paying attention. Lily considered this with the expression of someone updating their rule book under protest. Then I'm going to start paying attention too, she said. Good, he said. That's the right response. Clara sat across the room mending a shirt and watched the three of them around the lamp and thought, this is it. This is the thing I couldn't see from the stagecoach. This specific table, these specific people, this particular winter evening. She thought about this woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach in July, the $12.40, the bone-handled knife, the letter that was supposed to be a future and turned out to be a direction rather than a destination. That woman had been braced in every muscle, had held herself so tightly against the next blow that she'd stopped being able to feel the things that weren't blows. She'd been doing it for years by then, since Thomas died, since the boarding house, since the long months of managing alone. You developed a posture for survival that worked exactly as well as it needed to and cost you everything it cost you, and you stopped noticing the cost. What surprised her, looking back on it now, was not that she'd found her way here. It was that she'd needed to be surprised by it. She'd been so certain she knew the shape of what her life was. A narrowing thing, a making do, a series of stones to step on towards something that might one day be stable. That she'd very nearly talked herself out of what was standing right in front of her. Not Ethan, not the ranch. The capacity to want things. The capacity to let the ground under her feel real. That was what fear of losing everything did to you over time. It didn't just protect you from loss. It protected you from fullness, too. It kept you in a crouch when you could have been standing upright, because standing upright meant there was further to fall. She'd had to be forced upright by circumstance, by the particular pressure of Briggs and loan clauses and a house that needed people in it and a man who said things plainly and meant them. She wasn't entirely proud of that. She thought a better version of herself might have stood up on her own, but she'd learned to stop waiting to be the better version before she let herself have things. The better version was made from the same days the regular version lived in. You built it as you went, or you didn't build it at all. Eleanor Foley died in January. Art sent word by Ryder on a Tuesday morning, and Ethan went to him that day and Clara followed 2 days later, because the first day was for the men to sit together in the way men sat with loss, and the second day was for the women. And she brought food, and Hattie came with her, and they worked in Eleanor's kitchen, and let Art Foley rest for the first time in months. At the burial, which was small, out on the Foley property under the oak trees, Clara stood next to Ethan in the cold and looked at Art Foley's face and thought about all the things a person built a life around, and how those things didn't stop mattering when the immediate crisis was over. They kept mattering, kept demanding, kept asking you to show up. She found Art afterward and took his hands in both of hers. She knew, she said, about the ruling, about the ranch. She knew it was going to be all right. Art's jaw was tight. She said she was glad you came here, he said. She said that to me the day after you visited, that she was glad there was a woman in this county who saw the whole board. Clara held his hands for a moment more. The ranch will keep, she said. You'll keep, and if you need help, you ask. That's not weakness. That's what we're all here for. He nodded, not trusting his voice. She let go and stepped back to stand next to Ethan, and he took her hand the way he'd started doing in recent months. Not for any particular occasion, just when they were standing next to each other and there was room for it. And they stood together in the January cold under the oak trees while Art Foley said goodbye to Eleanor. Spring came and the garden came back. Clara had planned it over the winter with the seed catalogs, properly this time, with the spacing right and the rows oriented for the morning light and the beans far enough from the tomatoes to not fight each other for water. Lily helped her plant it on a warm March morning with a seriousness of purpose that Clara found genuinely moving. Lucy dug holes with a trowel and filled them in and dug them again, which was not particularly useful, but which she did with such clear satisfaction that Clara didn't have the heart to redirect her. Ethan fixed the south fence in February, which had taken longer than expected because 2 of the posts were rotted at the base and had to be replaced entirely. He came in the second evening with bleeding knuckles and a look of frustrated accomplishment, and Clara cleaned the knuckles without being asked and said, "Same hand as last summer." And he said, "Different fingers." And she said, "That's not a meaningful improvement." And he almost smiled. They were better with each other by spring than they'd been in the fall, and better in the fall than summer, and she thought probably this was how it went when it was real. Not a crescendo, but a deepening. Not a single moment, but the accumulation of all the ordinary ones. The morning coffee and the evening lamp and the arguments about small things, and the agreements about large ones, and the specific comfort of being known by someone who'd watched you long enough to see past the version you showed the world. She wasn't without fear. She didn't think she'd ever be without it entirely. But it had changed its shape. It had gone from a fear that filled all the available space to a fear that lived in one corner, acknowledged, specific, something she could look at without it looking back and consuming her. In April, a letter came from the commissioner's office advising that the inquiry into Harlan Briggs's lending practices had resulted in a formal censure, a fine, and the dissolution of his administrative role within the land association. The letter further noted that the association itself was being reorganized under a board elected directly by member ranchers, rather than appointed by the prior administration. Ethan read the letter at the kitchen table and handed it to Clara without comment. She read it and set it down. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She sat with it for a moment. She'd expected more feeling. What she found instead was something quieter and more durable than feeling. A sense of the ledger closed, the account balanced, the case file complete. "The wooden box," she said. "What about it?" "I'm going to take the documents out and burn them in the yard. Keep the box for something else." He looked at her. "All of them?" "We have the commissioner's ruling filed with the county. We don't need the copies anymore." She picked up her coffee. "I don't want a box full of Harlan Briggs in my kitchen for the next 20 years. He thought about this. "That's fair," he said. They burned the papers that afternoon in the yard, in the iron drum Ethan used for brush. The twins watched with the careful interest they gave to fire in controlled settings. And Lucy asked why they were burning papers, and Clara said because sometimes when something is finished, you make it finished all the way. And Lucy thought about this and said that made sense. And Lily said she wanted to put one in, so Clara let her feed the last page in herself, which Lily did with great ceremony. The papers burned clean. Clara watched the last of them go and felt the specific lightness of a thing genuinely set down. Shut. They went to the coast in July. It had been a real promise, not the kind that gets moved for the next practical thing. And the thing after that, until it's forgotten. Ethan held to it with the same steadiness he brought to most things. And on the 14th of July, they packed the wagon and drove west toward the ocean, all four of them, with food for 3 days and bedrolls, and the twins asking every 30 minutes if they were almost there. The first time the twins saw the ocean, they went absolutely silent, which was so unusual that Clara and Ethan both stopped and looked at each other. The Pacific in July was cold and enormous and gray-green and moved with a sound that got into your chest and stayed there. Lily stood at the edge of the sand with her hands at her sides and her mouth slightly open and didn't say anything for a full minute. Lucy sat down directly in the sand without any preamble and started picking up things, shells, rocks, a piece of worn glass, and examining each one with the focused attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. Clara stood next to Ethan at the edge of the bluff above the beach and looked at the water. "I haven't seen the ocean since I was 11, she said. "My father took us to the Atlantic once. I forgot how it sounds." "How does it sound?" She thought about it. "Like something that doesn't care about any of the things you've been worried about," she said, "in a way that's helpful rather than frightening." He stood with her and looked at the water, and she felt his arm against hers and didn't move away from it. "Clara," he said. "Yes. I want to tell you something, and I want you to just hear it without immediately being practical about it." She looked at him. "That's a concerning preamble." "I know." He was watching this water. "When Sam wrote me about you, he said he'd found someone worth building a life with, and I thought, at the time, that's Sam. That's how he talks. Everything was worth building. Every person was worth knowing." He paused. "But he was right. That's what you are. I want you to know that I know it." Clara looked at him for a long moment, at the face she'd read every morning for a year, the face that had gone from a stranger's to the most familiar thing in her world. "You're not easy to surprise," she said. "No. You just surprised me." Something shifted in his expression, something soft and almost uncertain that she didn't see from him often and valued when she did. "Good," he said. "It seemed like something worth saying." "It was," she said. "It was worth saying." Down on the beach, Lucy had found something that required Lily's immediate attention, and Lily had gone to look, and they were crouched over it together with their heads nearly touching, two small figures against the enormous gray water, already arguing amiably about what it was. Clara watched them and thought, I came here with nothing. A bag and $12.40 and two children who trusted me to know the next step even when I couldn't see it. And I didn't know the next step. I never knew it as far ahead as I pretended. I just kept moving and trusted that the stone would be there when my foot came down. And it was. Every time it was. Not because the world was kind. The world was not reliably kind. She'd given up expecting that at 17, but because you moved toward the right things with your eyes open and your hands honest and your word good, and you let people help you when they offered and you helped them back when you could, and you didn't let fear make all your decisions even when it wanted to, and you kept the accounts. You kept the accounts. You kept them accurately, and you didn't lie to yourself about what they said. That was the whole thing in the end. That was all it was. You looked at what was real, and you worked with that, and you didn't waste the days you had on the shape of days you wished you had instead. That was what she had learned, and it had cost her enough that she meant to hold on to it. Ethan said, "Should we go down?" She turned from the water. "Yes," she said. "Let's go." They walked down to the beach together, and the sand was cold under their feet, and the wind came off the water carrying salt and cold and the smell of something ancient. And Lucy looked up from her collection of shells and said, "Mama, there are so many kinds." And Clara crouched down next to her and looked at them spread out on the sand, white ones and gray ones and one that was a deep rust orange, and said, "There are. Which one do you like best?" Lucy pointed to the rust orange one without hesitation. "That one, because it's the most different." "That's a good reason," Clara said. Lily came over with something she'd found further down the beach, a piece of driftwood shaped, if you tilted your head, vaguely like a horse. She presented it to Ethan with the gravity of a formal offering. He took it seriously. He examined it from 3 angles. "I see it," he said, "around the neck." "Exactly," Lily said, deeply satisfied. He tucked it under his arm and kept it for the whole day without being asked to, because that was the kind of man he was. He understood which things needed to be kept, and he kept them. They stayed on the coast for 3 days, sleeping in their bedrolls under the wagon when it was clear and under a shed roof at the small settlement nearby when it rained. The twins ate more than seemed physically possible for people their size, and asked approximately 800 questions about the ocean, most of which Clara could answer, and a few of which Ethan answered from a knowledge she hadn't known he had, about tides and currents and the fishing boats he'd watched as a child somewhere she hadn't yet heard the whole story of. There were whole stories she hadn't heard yet. That was the thing about a life built alongside another person. The stories came out when they were ready, not all at once, not in a flood, a bit at a time. You learned someone the way you learned a piece of land, slow and by season, and you found new things in the knowing even years in. She was looking forward to the years. On the last morning before they packed the wagon, she walked down to the water alone in the early light, before the others were up. She stood at the edge of the wet sand where the waves came in and pulled back and stood with her feet getting cold and looked at the horizon, which was just the line where the gray water met the gray sky, simple and enormous and entirely indifferent. She thought about the relay station in July, Briggs's voice, the gate at the Thompson Ranch fence, the kitchen table where she'd sat across from a stranger and made a fair exchange. She thought about the wooden box and the documents burning in the yard, and Eleanor Foley's laugh, and Art Foley's face at the hearing, and Mrs. Everett stamping receipts with conviction. She thought about what she'd built here. Not built instead of what she'd lost. Not built in spite of it, built from it, the way you built anything real. By using what you had, including the broken parts, especially the broken parts, because they were the ones that taught you what held and what didn't. She had come here looking for a foothold and had found a foundation. The difference between those two things, she now understood, was not the ground itself, but what you were willing to let it become. A wave came in around her feet and receded, pulling at the sand, and she stood in the cold in the gray morning and felt, without qualification and without apology, that she was exactly where she belonged. She'd work out the Southfield drainage when they got home. Ethan thought they could run a channel east to resolve the flooding problem. She thought he was right, but wanted to look at it again before they committed. They'd argue about it pleasantly over coffee in the morning and arrive at something better than either of them had started with, which was how their arguments usually went. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. She turned and walked back up the beach, toward the wagon, toward her family coming awake in the gray coastal morning, toward the long road home.